Hmm. Okay, I think we're ready. Mm, Okay, so what we want to get in today is a theory known as social identity theory, and so it kind of has a kind of a long history in it, in that it started just after around World War II, when a gentleman with the last name of Trazol wanted to know or figure out how it would be that millions of people could either be actively or submissively or nonchalantly allowing millions of other people die in the Holocaust. And Tragével was actually um, a, a, a Holocaust survivor. And he really wanted to know, because we know that in a given society, only about 2 to 3% of that society is actually a sadistic people, meaning that they would purposely go and harm other people to the point of homicide or true self-harm. And so how is it that an entire country, almost not all, would engage either passively or actively in the extermination of millions of other people? And this became the start of a line of research into what's known as social identity theory. And what social identity theory in its most basic form is that we have a need to affiliate with people who are like us. And in that process, we find the group, we find our quote unquote, we find our tribe of people, and that identity we have with those people become a part of who we are. It becomes who we are. Okay. And just like when you want to protect your own self, your own ego, you get to the point where you want to protect that those social identities that are provided for you, okay, that you're a part of. And therefore you start doing what's called in-group and out-group comparisons. And of course, because you want your group to look better, you tend to start to discriminate and belittle out groups. Okay. And this actually became the best way of understanding what happened in Germany and without the Holocaust, because that strong identification of being German and then the propaganda mixed in with it, there was this need to make sure that German people survived. And of course, through the propaganda, that meant the elimination of an outgroup, mainly the Jewish people. Okay. And if you want to think about how intense this is, if you're a parent and someone starts saying nasty things about being a parent and you get upset, if you identify male or female or non-binary and people start saying bad things about your gender, you tend to get upset and frustrated with that. If you're strong in politics, whether you're conservative or liberal, you protect those two camps of life. And if you think about it, we get to the point where we protect it to the brink of hurting or harming other people. If you think about things like riot behavior, the extermination of entire countries, nations, like what happened here in the Americas with the Native American population. So this is a very powerful tool, a very powerful method. Now, as you will see, though, in about the last 20, I would say 20, 25 years, if social identity is so important that it brings us to the point of harming out groups or people who aren't like us, then it has to have some benefit. It has to have some reason that it exists. And sure enough, we find that individuals who have strong social identities and affiliate with groups, whether it be a religion, a college, whatever it may be, are healthier, they live longer, and we'll see here in a few minutes all the other benefits of identification with a group, okay? But we need to start with the need to belong or social connection and its antagonist, loneliness and rejection, okay? Because what you'll find working with many of the individuals you will with group addiction, domestic violence, mental illness, is that because of their condition, they're often made to believe that they're members of some out group, that they're outcasts. And they have a hard time getting in with what would quote unquote normal society. All right. And so they're going through constant rejection and loneliness. And we have to understand how that then influences their behavior and their situation. One of the benefits of a treatment group is its development of a group identity, its ability to bring individuals together, find out that I'm not alone in the world, and that I can have a common identity with some other people. And those have real big benefits, not only in fighting loneliness and depression and those types of things, but you'll see that it has several other benefits well beyond that. And I will say that recent research starting in about 2014, I believe it is, has started researching the implementation of understanding someone's social identity in the treatment arena, meaning one-on-one counseling. So they'll use traditional treatment like cognitive behavioral therapy, but then they'll implement exploration of one's identity, okay? And we find that increases the treatment success almost exponentially. It goes from about 13% up to about 40%. So we will see the benefit even in individual counseling, talking about someone's identity and place in the world, okay? But let's just talk first about some variables that lead us, that drive us to affiliate with others and to create identities with other people, okay? I mentioned social connection. What I want you to think about this list is this is the antagonist. This is the opposite of social connection, okay? And you'll note that loneliness and social rejection are in two separate categories, and I'll explain why that is here in just a minute, okay? So loneliness as a definition is a negative emotional motivational state that promotes both self-protection while at the same time promotes social connection. So let's break this down just a little bit. What is a negative emotional motivational state? Because when we think about negative emotions, we don't think about it being a motivational state as well, okay? And if I were to put this in brain terms, when we experience lonely, the dopaminergic areas of the brain fire, which means the motivational areas of the brain start to be active, and the serotonin areas, the emotional areas, start to be active, specifically the amygdala, which is associated with fear, okay? And so it's kind of this dual state where you want to protect yourself and you don't want any further loss or harm, but at the same time, it's driving us to need to be with other people, okay? And we have two forms of social loneliness, and this again is where the group process can come into play. We have social loneliness, or in the literature, it's also known as social isolation. And this is the experience when a person does not feel like they have a sufficient number of social connections, Okay, so this means that your tribe is either too big or too small, and you don't feel like there's enough people in your world that you can really rely on. Okay. Then we have emotional loneliness. Okay. Emotional loneliness is the experience when there is a loss of a close emotional relationship with someone else. Not just a social connection, but this is someone that you can confide in, you have a deep emotional connection with, and the like. And I would love to give you a number of how many individuals you should have social connection with and how many emotional relationships you should have, but it really varies from person to person. And we actually are finding that genetically, this almost is genetically determined how much social connection and how much emotional connection a person needs. Okay. But for example, social loneliness, I use the example of Facebook. Okay. There's some people on Facebook that can have 10, 20 friends, close relatives, those kinds of things, and they're good. That they're happy with that. And then there's some people who need a friend list of 1,000, 2,000 people in order to feel satisfied about their social connection on Facebook. That's just one example of social loneliness. Emotional loneliness, again, also varies. There's some people who just need that one maybe intimate partner in their life, or close to a mother or father or a best friend, and they're good. And then there's some people I have a good friend of mine who, when she gets in trouble or she has problems, she'll call me, confide in me, look towards me, and then she'll call her mom, and then she'll call her sister, and then she'll call 2 other friends. And she needs all of that emotional connection with people in order to resolve or come to a conclusion of what she should do to, for example, resolve a problem that is affecting her emotionally. Okay. And this also explains, so you can sit in a crowd of 50 people and feel lonely because you're addressing the wrong kind of loneliness. Specifically too, if you have really close people and you still feel lonely, maybe you're not fulfilling that social connection aspect of loneliness. Okay. So we have these two, and coming into the group setting, I want you to think about, this is what groups have the opportunity to help a person fulfill. One, giving the opportunity to be open in a group setting and expressing oneself. Okay. 2, on the social loneliness and giving those social connections and providing those social connections through the membership in that group can reduce these issues, these non-connecting issues. Okay. And you'll notice that social rejection is in its own separate category. We can be lonely without losing someone. Okay. Usually that's what it stems from, but a lot of times it's just because we lost connection with people, or we lose some kind of emotional connection. Social rejection is when we're rejected by somebody. Okay. Specifically, you can be rejected by an intimate partner or just by even strangers, and you'll experience the pain of social rejection. Okay. But unlike loneliness, social rejection works on the physical areas of the brain. Meaning, so we have the dopaminergic areas, which is associated with motivation. We have the serotonin areas, which are associated with emotions. And then we have the opioid areas of the brain, which is associated with physical pain and relieving physical pain. Okay. And this is what happens when someone rejects us. One of the experiments they do is just this pure computer one while someone's sitting in an MRI machine. And you don't know the other person, you don't know the 2 other people, but what you're going to do is kind of play this little game on a computer screen where you throw a ball to one person, they throw it to the next person, and then they'll throw it back to you, and you just keep throwing the ball back and forth to each other. But eventually in the program, what happens is the other two people just start throwing the ball back and forth to each other, and they exclude the experiment participant. And sure enough, just that pure rejection by strangers and people you haven't met ignite this pain region of the brain. Okay. And conversely, we know that in pain experiments, when your intimate partner, if you're in severe pain, comes and holds your hand and comforts you, or something, or you get touched by another human being, that increases the opioid activity in the brain, trying to alleviate that physical pain that the person is going through as well. So there's pain benefits to this. Now, on this end, if you ever are rejected by anyone or experience that, treat it like it's a physical injury. Okay, meaning that you don't, if you cut yourself, you don't sit there and watch it bleed. In the social rejection area, you don't sit there and just self-ponder on what's going on or do this self-discovery thing. No, when you cut yourself, you stop the bleeding, you clean it, and you put a bandage on it. Same goes with social rejection. Instead of becoming isolate, going through quote unquote the self-discovery phase, get out there and do stuff with people, and that will reduce the pain of social rejection. Interestingly, if you don't want to be around people, take Tylenol 300 milligrams a day for 5 days, and the pain of being rejected by someone will be greatly reduced, if not gone. So there's some advice if you experience rejection. But again, with our group members, and this is important to note, when we have groups and the group starts rejecting other people in the group, they're going through a physical pain state. Okay, so it does no good to say, how did that make you feel? Instead, we should be asking, where does that hurt? Where is that pain? And name it for what it is. It's pain. It's not a feeling. They're experiencing pain. And so keeping those kinds of things in mind when working with people in a group is important. Okay. So what are some 4 things that as a group we should be providing individuals as they come in to up this feeling of belonging and increase things like self-esteem and self-awareness? Okay. Well, we have what's called 2 relatively cognitive motives, which cognitive motives are kind of thought processes, thinking, the ability to know what next action you should take. And then we have 2 relative affective motives, meaning emotional affect, the way we feel about ourselves. And these are related, the affective ones are related to self-esteem, which is our general sense of liking or disliking who we are. And self-awareness, knowing what actions I should take given the situation, okay? And in the group setting, and again, we'll talk about this as we go through the facilitation process, we have to understand that given these 2 motives, people enter a group with 4 things that need to be in place, okay? On the cognitive end, people have to have the ability to understand and control the situation, all right? So in a normal social situation, we need to have a shared meaning and prediction, meaning that we have to understand, 1, why we are here and where it's going to lead us as a group, okay? The next one is controlling. We need to perceive the contingency between behaviors and outcomes. So when we're talking about the group setting, we need to have an understanding of what's going to happen what the expectations are. We do this through things like an informed consent. We do this by making sure each group meeting is similar to each other. So we start with a check-in. We then go into maybe some processing, and then we do some skill building, and then we do checkouts. And that happens every time, okay? And so those are the facilitation ends of that. And then we need to look at the effective needs people have. And we look to others for self-enhancement. And this is the need to view self basically worthy and improvable. And this is why we want to, in a group setting, create a positive atmosphere where we focus on each other's strengths instead of weaknesses. And we have what's called a positive growth mindset about our group members, that no one is stuck where they're at, that everybody is improvable and everybody can make change, okay? And then the other thing that we need to provide in the group setting is the need for trust. Now, trust isn't what we typically think about when we think about, for example, intimate relationships, where if you do something for me, I will reciprocate it later, okay? Trusting in this situation is basically seeing the situation as benign, meaning not harmful to the individual. And as many of you have expressed in this course, this is why we need to spend some time talking about how to resolve conflicts within groups and how to resolve individual conflicts that may affect the group setting, because all of this can influence the group members' trusting of the group itself, okay? So these are 4 things, and I'm going to say this, these are 4 things we need to provide to a group as a facilitator, but these are also 4 things that we all need. These are universal needs that we all have. So it's just not needs that are for someone going through some type of treatment. These are things that are universals that we all need. And so I'm just going to go over this very quickly to kind of explain what I mean by identity and all of these kinds of things. Is William James came up with the notion of the self-concept. William James is known as the father of American psychology. He wrote one of our first American textbooks, and he coined this term self-concept. And your self-concept is basically everything that you can say is you, okay? And contained within that self-concept, we have 2 types of identities or 2 types of selves. We have our personal self or our personal identity. William James originally called this the spiritual self. And this is everything that is unique about you that sets you apart from the person sitting next to you, assuming someone's sitting next to you right now. But how it makes you different than anyone in your household, even though you're all born and raised the same way, as an example, okay? Your social identity is everything that is you because it's provided by your social world. So, for example, gender, race, occupation, family status, whether you're a parent, mother, grandson, blah, blah, blah. We can go on and on. The list is very expansive. Some social identities are stable. So, for example, a sense of our gender and what it means to us tends to be a stable identity over time. And some identities are transient. Okay, so for example, if you think about the typical way, you start with a student identity, and then when you graduate, you go and get your professional identity. Now, I know a lot of you are working on both at the same time, but eventually I hope that your college identity, social identity is eventually gone unless you go into teaching. But this is what I mean. A couple, for example, you get married, you have an identity as a spouse. You get divorced, you now have an identity as a single person or a divorced person. If your partner passes away, you have the identity of a widow. And so even those types of relationships can change over time, okay? Now, and again, this is where it becomes important as understanding a group and what we're doing in the group process is your group members are going to gain a social identity with that group. And we have to understand that that's going to be a transient identity. And that's why we need to have good beginnings to a group that leads to what are you going to do without the group in your life anymore? Eventually, that's going to happen. And so part of our work is helping individuals do that identity transition from being a group member to being more back into the general society dealing with these issues, okay? And it should be no mistake that you'll see that the social identities, we have quite a bit more social identities than we do personal identities, excuse me. And that this is presented in a Venn diagram because there's a lot of things about our identity that we definitely absorb as part of who we are. So for example, if what makes you unique has to do with your gender identity, then those two things kind of become melded together, that they almost become inseparable from each other. All right. Now, this is where we can have some concern about treatment and treatment modalities, because we often say addiction is a lifelong disorder and it's going to be a part of you forever. And so there becomes this temptation, and among a lot of individuals, they do, to be within this overlapping area where it's part of what makes me uniquely me, and it's part of what society or a social identity I have with other people who have addiction, okay? And one of the tricks is to kind of get a person to push that out of their personal identity and into this broader range of a self-concept. Okay. All right, and this is also, again, these graphs right here kind of indicate why we need to be careful about working with people really on that personal and individual level within a group setting, especially when there's an identified group and we have that identity, okay? This is research done on loneliness. You can see on the left, we have social loneliness, we have emotional loneliness. And the bars I want you to pay attention to are the ones that are circled. The other two bars were control conditions that helped establish what's called the baseline, meaning what would the average individual who was just taking a survey of loneliness score. So this blue line and this green line is averages based on no activity. They just came in and they take the loneliness scale, okay? It's these two conditions that are of interest, okay? Because in one group, we're going to simply ask the person to identify 5 positive qualities of their social identity. In the beginning, we used things like student because it was largely a student population. But in later replications of this, we used occupational identity, parental identity, grandparent identity, and so on. In the second, so that was one condition a person could be assigned to. The second condition is what's called the personal identity group. In this, we just asked for 5 positive qualities that make them unique compared to everyone else. So we were listing their personal identity, okay? And as you can see, when a person is purely thinking about just themselves and what makes, again, we're putting this in a positive tone too. We're saying what makes you a unique person, focus on you, versus focus on your identity you have with other people, okay? You'll notice that this group is far more lonely when you just focus on the individual. It's almost double baseline here, close to double here, but almost 3 times as lonely as the social identity group. So these individuals that right now are feeling as close social connection to who they are, okay? And this, again, is one of the benefits of the group setting, is we have this ability to draw people out of their shell, out of this place where they think that it's just them against the world. And we can put them in a place where they can identify with people who have similar issues that they have. And one of the tricks of being a facilitator is balancing those things those individuals needs to do in order not to be that anymore, meaning reduce consumption of alcohol, for example, or not give into or control triggers from trauma. Okay. But also balancing on what is the positive aspect of going through the addictive process of experiencing trauma. Okay. Because there are some, believe it or not, we weren't born not to be stressed in some way. Okay. So that's what we're dealing with when we're looking at the group setting and we're looking at these factors. Okay. And then I just want to bring up a model that kind of indicates what happens when a person experiences some damage or denial to their social identity. So what could happen, for example, if someone has a bad experience in a group and feels like they have to leave or that they've been rejected by it? What does it mean when a person goes through some traumatic event and they lose something that they held close to them? One example could be people who go through domestic violence, and they're completely have an identity as, let's say, a spouse or a girlfriend, and then they experience a severe trauma from their partner. Okay. This can lead to social and emotional loneliness, where in one category we ask, where do I belong? That's going to be social loneliness that we're experiencing. And then on the other end, we also question, who do I belong with? Which then leads to this notion of emotional loneliness. And if gone on long enough, we experience what's called failure to belong, and then failure to survive. Okay. Now, here's some interesting things about this process that we should note, is that all of these variables are either directly caused or associated with this failure to belong process. Okay. We know that people who have prolonged loneliness have lower mortality rates and higher morbidity rates. Now, mortality is the probability of how long you will live. Morbidity is the probability of getting some type of illness or disease state. Okay. And we found that loneliness, as it's prolonged, people tend to die at a younger age and tend not to have good health, or end up with some type of disease state like diabetes or cancer or any of the other major disease areas. Heart disease is majorly associated with it. Now, a lot of people theorized originally this is because when you lose social connection, you lose that motivation to take care of yourself. You lose that motivation to go exercise and eat right and all that thing. The problem is that we don't find that at all in the literature. That's kind of a social myth that we hold. No, just being lonely in and of itself has a negative impact on our health, irregardless of things like our lifestyle, how we eat, our exercise. And indeed, there was a comparative study that came out a year or so ago that said 1 week of loneliness is like smoking 10 to 20 packs of cigarettes without needing to smoke them. Okay, so there's that issue. All right, and we need to realize that. Suicide. So we'll talk about this here in a few minutes, but the kind of the recipe for suicidal thoughts and suicidal behavior is depression plus loneliness. And we'll get to that here in just a couple minutes when we look at some other things. Okay. Addiction is very much associated with prolonged loneliness and the need to protect oneself and need to escape. But we also find all of these other things, such as chronic homelessness is related to it, relationship problems, gang affiliation, family dysfunction, closed-mindedness, self-hatred, aggression towards others, criminal behavior. All of these are associated with this failure to belong, okay? Hence, why it's important in the group setting that we provide these things and provide this sense of belonging where our clients are at. Okay. Now, at the same time, we also have to realize that there's a downside to social identity. And I'm going to just go through this very quickly. Social comparison theory and self-esteem suggests that when we do a group, we form an in-group, which becomes an extension of ourself. And then out-groups become who we're going to compare to in order to maintain some sense of self-esteem. Through this process, we start to think we are, so negative valuation, we do either upward comparison or downward comparison to groups that are better than us, comparison to groups that are lower than us. Either way, it leads to some type of prejudice or discrimination, okay? If you've ever, for example, facilitated a group where you don't have direct experience with what the people are experiencing. So for example, if you go into the addiction field, but you haven't went through addiction yourself, your group members will constantly want you to have that identity with them. I can't tell you how many times people in my groups said, oh, we know that you've went through this too. Even though I hadn't, especially in the area of domestic violence when I did those groups. And so that's something as a facilitator that you will need to navigate. And that's where you have to be careful again with things like self-disclosure and those types of things. Okay. All right. So here's an issue that often we come up with, and you will see this a lot among Native American youth, especially, where there's kind of an identity crisis where you have two competing social identities. So right now with Native youth, there's a lot of issues dealing with things like addiction and failure to thrive and those types of things. And we really think it's because it's this identity crisis where people found that individuals who come into a situation where their social identities conflict have more difficulty planning for future events and being able to see beyond the moment. So when there's that social identity, me as a Native American, me as a, what should we term this, colonialized American, okay? Or mainstream, quote unquote, American. And in situations where these come into conflict, this can put the person into where they're unable to look at their future and plan for their future. Indeed, they get stuck right here in the moment. Okay, and if you think about a lot of the youth that we work with, that have this kind of identity crisis, this conflicting identity, it does become very difficult to help them get beyond this conflict and think about their future and where their future is going. Okay. So again, when we're working with youth that have conflicting identities, this is something that we have to keep in mind and really strengthen, again, that group. Where do we go? We need to help them answer this question, these two questions. Where do I belong and who do I belong with? And that sense of moment will help alleviate, in a sense, these competing identities that individuals have, and strengthen those connections with those groups. And on the other end, importance of social connection and what we have found, this is just a small sample of stuff that has just come out this year. And it's just a small sample of the things that we were learning about social connection and keeping our identities correct. So this has been studied for actually several years, but it was solidified by what's called a meta-analysis by Armanen and Jakubowski, where we have recognized for years in the scientific literature that suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviors come in two forms. One is the depression plus loneliness route. And then the other one is the chronic illness, chronic pain route. Okay. Now, let me explain in the kind of a simple experiment that was done to explain the depression plus loneliness. Is a group of researchers went to a bunch of hospitals where they had two types of people who were admitted to the emergency room. Individuals who either their depression symptoms just became too much to manage, that they couldn't manage them anymore, but they did not have any suicidal attempt or ideation. They were just experiencing their depression at a high level. Okay. And then we had individuals who were admitted to the ER who were suicidal, had suicidal ideation or had an attempt. And we gave both groups a measure of depression and a measure of loneliness. And the results were really fascinating, is that we found that it was only the group that were suicidal or who had a suicidal attempt who scored high in depression, but also high in loneliness, meaning they were missing something from their social world. Either they were rejected or some type. And indeed, when I did a suicide completion analysis for the state of Montana, that was for 2014, 15, and 16, where I went through all the coroner reports to try and find links between the person's life and suicide, is a lot of them were either recently divorced, experienced job loss, had a history of depression or anxiety diagnoses, those types of things. There was that group. And then, of course, there's the chronic pain group that were suffering from chronic pain and they just couldn't take that pain anymore. Okay. So that's what we see when we see with suicidal patients. This is something to keep in mind when you're working with people who have depression or depression symptoms, is that make sure that they're engaging in their social world. It's very important so they don't go over that edge of ending their own life. And then this interesting one, alexithymia, is a kind of it's not a disorder. It's more of a disposition where a person has the hard time recognizing emotions in themselves and in other people, and have a hard time expressing emotions. Okay, so it comes in both forms. I don't understand your emotional state. I don't understand my emotional state. And so they're confused of what to do in that moment. Okay. We find that exlemia then followed by loneliness leads to what's called non-suicidal self-injury in adolescence, meaning self-harming injuries such as cutting or hurting or hitting oneself in some way. Could also include things like hair pulling, pulling your hair out, those types of injurious things. So one, not having an understanding of my own emotions and not being able to read the emotions of others. And then I feel this state of loneliness leads to those physical state injuries we found with self-injury, at least in adolescence. Yerke found that increased social connection and decreased loneliness in middle schools reduced dropout rates in high schools. So if you're working with youth, this is something to keep in mind. Help them become socially connected, help them decrease loneliness. This was kind of interesting. It was done with middle schools where for a couple years, they had half of the middle schools just run as regular. And then the other half, they implemented social connections and abilities to reduce loneliness and all of these programs that dealt with the social world, okay? And they found, even in middle school, that high school dropout rates were far less in those schools that focused on social connection than the standard school setting, okay? So there's something to keep in mind when working with young youth, okay? And then Zoe and Haslam, both separate researchers, found older adults who maintain career social connections after retirement live longer and healthier. So again, when you're working, if you're working with elderly populations, this is something to keep in mind, is help them stay connected with their past, stay connected with what they did in their careers, and stay connected with those individuals. Because it's shown both for men and women. This research was traditionally done on just men, because women weren't having a problem. They tend to stay more socially connected into their elderly years. But we're finding more and more women are having the same problems as men, is that we found with both men and women maintaining that career social connection after retirement tend to live longer and healthier lives, okay? And then Jordan 2023 found that social connection and self-care strategies decrease depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms. Now, this is interesting. So we're using having social connections, going and being with other people, emailing someone just randomly or texting someone and saying, hey, I'm thinking about you. Having that moment of social connection as a method of self-care, caring for oneself, which is very important in this field that we're in, okay? This decreases things like depression and anxiety and trauma symptoms better than traditional self-care strategies, including medications, therapy, meditation, mindfulness, all of those techniques that we've learned as a self-care strategy. Socially connecting with someone far outdoes any of those traditional self-care mechanisms. Hence, again, the importance of group work and having that ability for people to do that self-care while also having that ability to treat and have an open mind and an open experience to alleviate whatever issue that they're going through. Okay. All right. I think that's the end of